welcome to the 100th episode of the Tom Schimmer podcast. Happy Monday, everyone. Hope everyone had a great weekend. Well, I'm headed overseas this week. Today, Monday, March 27th, I'm headed to Johannesburg, South Africa to work with the American International School of Johannesburg. I was there back in January of 2019. So looking forward to returning to the school and doing 4 days worth of work toward the end of the week and over the weekend. Other upcoming events this spring, Standards-Based Learning in Action 2-day training. That'll be in Idaho Falls, Idaho, April 13th and 14th. The Assessment and Grading Conference will be in Atlanta, Georgia, April 24th through 26th. I'll be there on the 24th and 25th because on the 26th and 27th, we've got the Grading from the Inside Out 2-day training in Salt Lake City, Utah. As well, we've got the big conference, the Assessment Center Institute. That's going to be in Las Vegas, Nevada, May 24th through the 26th. I'll have links in the show notes for all of those events should they be of interest to you. You can also find them on the Solution Tree website. I also want to remind you, as I have in previous weeks, that I have a new book coming out this April. It's called Redefining Student Accountability, a proactive approach to teaching behavior outside the gradebook. The book is really all about how we teach responsibility and other student attributes without distorting achievement levels or achievement grades. Currently, you can pre-order the book. It ships April 21st. That's the publication date. I'll also have a link in the show notes for that as well. Okay, thanks for tuning in again this week. A big welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time, and a big thank you to longtime listeners. I really appreciate all of you. This week, my guest is Ron Ritchhart. Ron was the Senior Research Associate and Principal Investigator at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is also the author of several books, one of which we're going to focus on today, entitled Creating Cultures of Thinking. An assessment corner this week, I want to talk about the dangers of idea cults when it comes to conversations about assessment and grading. So, that's today's plan. Let's get to it. My conversation with Ron Ritchhart is coming up, but first, don't at me. Well, in fact, this week, I suppose you can at me, because I'm going to open this week with a simple thank you. This is, of course, episode 100, so I wanted to just express my gratitude to you, the listeners, for joining me each week, or, of course, every other week currently, on this professional journey, whether it's through emails, messages, Zoom meetings, face-to-face workshops, or wherever you've met. I so appreciate the kind words and thoughtful comments you've given me since I started this project back in September of 2020. Now, occasionally, I do also receive some suggestions that really help make the podcast better for all of you, so I really do appreciate that. Now, the most bizarre feedback I've ever received from a listener was a thank you, sort of. The person emailed me and thanked me for putting timestamps in the show notes so they could fast forward past the opening segment and get right to the interviews. I believe the exact words he used were, thanks for putting the time codes in the show notes so I can skip over your don't at me segment. It's like, what? I was like, either he thinks he's actually complimenting me or this is some kind of complisult, like it's an insult that's kind of masked as a compliment. But anyway, you got to take the good with the bad, right? It's all good. And good on him for at least telling me honestly. I also have to give a shout out once again to my good friend, Andrea DeVito, who planted the seeds of this idea back in July of 2020, when she said to me one night as a group of friends were, drinking wine at night, and she looked at me and said, Tom, you should really have a podcast. And once she said that to me, I couldn't shake it. And so it began. So thanks to Andrea for planting that seed. The podcast really is a labor of love, and I do feel the pressure to produce something that pushes your thinking and is worthy of your time. The pressure isn't a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I feel that pressure, but it's a good thing because I've met many of you, not all of you, of course, but I've met many of you face to face, and you all are no joke. Okay, seriously. Now, obviously, like I said, I haven't met the majority of you, but I don't get the sense that any of you have a tolerance for fluff. So I really do feel compelled to have thoughtful guests and to provide thoughtful content. I know that you all don't always agree with me and my takes, and that's fine. I rant sometimes. Life would be boring if we all had the same opinion about everything, right? And spirited debate in our society is something I kind of think we've lost a little bit, right? Being able to see both sides of an issue is a bit of a lost art. I strive to be balanced and thoughtful in my approach, and all of that really does have to do with you. And I know that sounds like pandering, but honestly, I mean, you've already downloaded this episode, so I get the statistics anyway, right? But so I'm really not pandering to you. I'm being serious. With 100 episodes, we're going to cross the 100,000 download threshold as well, and that's another great milestone. Yes, the number of downloads is exciting because it is honestly a boost to the ego, and we're all looking for ways to broaden our reach and to go sort of viral, so to speak. And anyone who creates content, podcasts or any other content, they're lying when they tell you they don't look at their statistics, their likes or their retweets. We all look, okay? It's just that people like me are just more honest about it. But anybody who's pretending that they don't care about their downloads, they're not telling you the truth. Apparently, the ratings are what push a show up the ladder. So if you all, have a chance, within a short period of time to leave a review, who knows? You may be responsible for helping this podcast expand the listening audience. But anyway, I just want to say, thank you for joining me through each episode. I really am grateful. Thank you for supporting the guests that come on the podcast and buying their books and amplifying their messages. I know they really appreciate it. And I've had so many great comments from you all about the guests I've had on the podcast. I want to thank you for the questions that some of you have sent in for Assessment Corner. That has really forced me to consider thoughtful responses to many of the dilemmas that you're facing. And now, while the majority of Assessment Corner topics, of course, are manufactured by me, my favorite Assessment Corner segments are actually when I get the opportunity to answer listener questions. So don't hesitate to email those questions to me if you have any. I would love to answer those on air because I'm sure someone else is also dealing with that same question or the same dilemma. When I started this podcast, I didn't know what it would turn into, and I didn't even know if I'd get past 2 or 3 or 5 episodes. But here we are at episode 100, and I'm really excited to see what the future of the podcast holds. But for now, I've got more great guests lined up for this spring that's going to lead us into the summer. Probably going to do a summer series, but I'm not really sure what I'm going to do for the summer, but I'll figure that out in short order. So cheers to you. And cheers to you supporting this podcast for 100 episodes. I wouldn't keep doing it if it wasn't for you, the listeners. So thank you.
3, 2, 1,
Joining me this week is Ron Ritchhart. Ron is a world-renowned educator, researcher, and author. For 25 years, Ron has served as a senior research associate and principal investigator at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where his research focused on understanding how to develop, nurture, and sustain thoughtful learning environments for both students and for teachers. Ron's ability to seamlessly merge theory, research, practice, and application together in a highly accessible and engaging manner has made him a sought-after speaker and a best-selling author of numerous books that include Intellectual Character, book titled Making Thinking Visible, Creating Cultures of Thinking, The Power of Making Thinking Visible, and the latest book, which is coming out in June of 2023, is Cultures of Thinking in Action. I met Ron for the first time in 2016 at the NISA Fall Conference in Doha, Qatar, and I am thrilled to reconnect with Ron today. So Ron, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Great to be here, Tom.
Yeah, great to have you here. Looking forward to this conversation. I have, since becoming familiar with your work and then seeing you at the conference and continuing to follow your work, you certainly are that world-renowned leader and expert in the area of bringing thinking back into classrooms and developing those cultures. So before we get to that, though, because I think that's going to be a very interesting conversation for listeners, I, of course, provided some of the highlights of your career in the introduction, but maybe provide us a little bit more detail about your journey. Where did your career begin? What were all of those sort of pivotal steps along the way? And how did you sort of end up at Harvard and Project Zero and all of the work that you do today?
All right, I'll try to do the best I can.
Succinctly.
I actually began my teaching career in New Zealand, where I taught 35, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds all in one classroom, teaching them everything. at that time, there were no so-called specialist teachers. So we had to teach everything, no librarians, no music teachers, no sports or PE teachers. So I had those students all day long. That kind of began my career. Then I came back to the States where I taught art. And then I taught elementary school for a long time in Denver, Colorado. And while I was in there, one of the things that I became kind of uncomfortable with was the way that I was teaching mathematics. I realized I was kind of teaching mathematics to my students exactly the same way that I had been taught. So I got a master's degree in mathematics education and moved my teaching to be much more in parallel with the way that I was teaching reading and writing, and much more of an authentic and a workshop approach. So the shift had been much more about kind of problem solving there. I then moved to middle school and high school mathematics, teaching that, also still in Denver, Colorado, and received the Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics Teaching during that time. Wrote a book on the teaching of numeracy, also while kind of still a teacher there. And then, without kind of a little bit of a surprise to me, was something I was looking for. Someone approached me and said that they really thought that I should pursue a doctorate, that they thought that I had a lot to give to education. And that was kind of planted a seed in my mind that might be something that I would be interested in. And one of the people that I had been reading and been influenced by at that time was David Perkins, his book, Smart Schools, really thinking about how is it that we do make our teaching about understanding, about thinking. And so I was very intrigued by that. So wrote to him, began a little bit of correspondence there, and then found myself applying to grad school at Harvard, and was lucky enough to get in there. And so began my work and my research there. And of course, David was my advisor, and one of the big projects at the time at the Harvard Graduate School of Education was the Teaching for Understanding project, which was actually the largest independently funded research project anywhere in the world at the time. So it was kind of a big thing. Howard Gardner was a part of that, Vito Perrone as well, a big 7-year project. So that was my initial kind of connection then to Project Zero. And then I kind of gradually got connected to other research projects there. And once I graduated, actually already had my own research project there about creativity and teaching that was funded by the Disney Foundation at the time. And so I kind of stayed on and then spent about 27 years there, all told. Mm-hmm. And I just officially retired from Harvard in 2021 during COVID, but I still continue all of my research and writing, and still kind of affiliated with Harvard, just not kind of as a full-time researcher.
Right. Fantastic career, of course, and we are going to dig into a lot of that research and that work, but I'm curious about the combination of math and art. That is a combination I have not seen a lot throughout the course of my career, and I'm wondering about how those two things, maybe as a bit of a preview, how did your background in teaching art and mathematics sort of help you or lead to a lot of the research you started to do in terms of thinking and cultures of creativity and et cetera? Did you draw upon those? Well, first of all, how did you end up in those jobs? And second of all, how did that sort of that background give you a little bit of insight as to how to bring thinking back into the classroom?
Well, I think, a little bit of just explaining kind of some of the teaching that I've done. My mother was an early childhood educator, and my father is an architect, an architectural engineer. So that kind of brings everything together.
It
So
does. It does.
architecture and engineering. So there's a lot of aesthetics, and so I grew up kind of looking at buildings, looking at design as a big part of that. My father was also loved art and collected art and going to museums. So and always really kind of encouraged that in me. So I think that combination, architecture is kind of a good combination of that kind of at least the aesthetic element. And design element there, along with the mathematics there.
Yep.
So those kind of combined there.
It makes sense now. It makes a lot more sense because the art math combination is something you just don't see that a lot, and it's great to have that insight. Okay, so let's dig into the substance of our conversation, and I want to begin with 3 core ideas. You often talk and write about 3 core ideas about how schools must be about developing students' thinking dispositions, the need to make students' thinking visible, and the crucial role of classroom culture in supporting and shaping learning. So let's pick these off one at a time and maybe give you an opportunity to share a little bit about what you mean by that. So what do you mean when you say students' thinking dispositions?
Dispositions go by a lot of names, so people may be more familiar with the idea of habits of mind. Way back to John Dewey. John Dewey talked both about habits of mind and dispositions kind of interchangeably. So those words often are kind of used interchangeably. A disposition is a part of a person's character. It's a part of who they are. The word disposition tends to be used perhaps a little bit more in philosophy in talking about thinking, but it does also certainly appear in the psychological literature, which is more my background that I approach that. And after my work on the Teaching for Understanding project, the next project that I worked on was a project specifically around thinking dispositions. That was why what I was wanting to study actually when I went to grad school there. So I was very interested in my students as thinkers, in particular, and their metacognitive abilities and thinking about that. So metacognition kind of fits into a disposition there. There are always skills with any disposition. So you have to have some facility with the skills. But a disposition is more than just having a body of skills. It's having the motivation, the inclination to use and apply those skills. So curiosity would be another disposition people would be familiar with. So when we say that someone is curious, it's not only because they can ask questions, something that we all can do, but that person actually does ask questions. That person actually displays their curiosity by delving into those questions. So the idea of a disposition is that motivation and inclination to be able to affect those skills and to be able to use those abilities, put them into action. So you often say that dispositions kind of close the ability action gap there. And that's why we want to really kind of cultivate those dispositions.
And is it the case that we don't just want students to be able to sort of access those dispositions per se, but we want those to be default dispositions? We want their visceral reaction to be one of curiosity, of thinking, of creativity, and all of that.
And kind of by definitions, it's not about accessing that disposition, because if you have a disposition, it means that it is.
It's that default.
It's something that's there. So you can access your abilities. And so one of the criticisms that we might have about schools is that we spend a lot of time developing student skills, but are they actually going to use those skills? So, most teachers of reading are not content just to get students to read. They hope that they do read. They hope that they're enjoying reading. They hope they find, that reading is of interest to them throughout their life. So they are trying to develop those dispositions beyond the skills. So when we say we've got a disposition, we're kind of moving beyond a simple and a straightforward skills assessment to the action assessment.
Right. So I am curious. It's not that I'm doing curiosity right now, but I am curious. That's who I am. Right. Now, I think in 2023, most people would understand what we mean by this, but I just want to give you a chance to sort of highlight some big ideas. Like, how do we make thinking visible? What do you mean by that when you say make thinking visible? I think a lot of people do understand that concept, but for those who don't, what would you say to them when they say, well, how do I make thinking visible?
And I think that, this is something that teachers, have cared about for a very, very long time.
For sure.
And we kind of recognize that thinking, is something that is happening in an individual's mind. And so as teachers, we would love to know more about what is happening in the student's mind. So the idea of making thinking visible is the idea of, well, how do we get a window in to what is happening there? So we use all kinds of different techniques in terms of trying to uncover what is happening. Probably the technique that teachers have used the longest is by asking questions that will kind of peel back layers. So a student can give an answer, and the answer tells us, oh, the student has that information, but it doesn't tell us anything about their thinking behind that. How do they arrive at that information? So we might follow up and answer with a simple question of, well, what makes you say that? Tell me more about that. Where did that idea come from? So we ask questions that probe and that press, and that allow students then to make their thinking more visible to us. So we use also the idea of thinking routines, which are just simple, kind of scaffolds that, again, are designed to kind of externalize that process. We talked about metacognition in terms of dispositions. Well, one of the ways that metacognition develops in us as human beings is that process of metacognition, of being able to reflect on our thinking, being able to identify, being able to direct our thinking, is those processes are first externalized. We do that in a social environment. So we then gradually recognize, oh, I can be asking myself those questions. I can be kind of interrogating myself about, well, why do I think that? How am I putting those ideas together? What might I do next? So we create that internal dialogue, but we first experience it kind of externally there. So the idea of kind of having those scaffolds and structures, which we recognize, oh, I can use this for my own thinking to help that. So rather than looking at only the answers, when we're making thinking visible, we're trying to capture more of the process. How did students arrive there? How did they get there? So anything that helps to externalize that process, we would say, helps to make thinking visible. We do have to kind of qualify that idea of visible, because it gets confused in a couple of different senses. So in one sense, the idea, people think that visible has to be seen with the eyes. We use the word visible to mean apparent. So the thinking becomes more apparent, and we just use that in contrast with invisible. So when I ask you a question and you tell me more about how you derive that answer, that thinking has become more apparent to me, more visible to me as a way. The other way that word kind of gets confused is sometimes because there is a project about visual thinking. And so making thinking visible is not merely about we're just concerned with perception, we're just concerned with looking, we're concerned with kind of the visual aspect of things. So we're using the word visible there to mean more apparent, less invisible.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense in terms of apparent, because, it doesn't have to be singularly focused on just the visual. Let's go to the third one, which is about classroom culture. What are the specific sort of classroom aspects of classroom culture that support and shape a culture of learning, culture of thinking in a classroom? What do you think? What are you thinking there in terms of culture?
Well, I became this, all kind of links together. So when we think about the development of dispositions, dispositions are not directly taught. So, we don't teach lessons on curiosity to make kids more curious. Dispositions are kind of developed in kind of context. They are what we say enculturated. So we learn them through the process of being a part of a culture. And in my research that led to the book Intellectual Character, I studied how teachers who were really good at getting students to think, really good at developing their thinking dispositions, their habits of mind, how those teachers went about that process. And in that research, I kind of uncovered the kind of building blocks of culture. I noticed these teachers did not teach thinking skills lessons. Instead, they really did create that culture. And so in my analysis, really looking at, well, how is it that they did that? And I identified what I call 8 cultural forces. I chose to call them forces because just like the force of gravity, we don't wake up in the morning and decide, do we want gravity or not? We just have to kind of deal with it. It's there. So by the same token, when we talk about these cultural forces, it's not a matter of teachers inserting these into their classroom. It's a matter of them thinking about, well, how do I leverage these which are already there? So, for example, there's the cultural force of language. We're always using language. So what are the messages my language is conveying? The physical environment of a place. So how do we set up a room? What do we put on the walls is an aspect of the culture. The routines that we put in place become part of the culture there. Our modeling. So are we models of thinking and learning and, all of those dispositions like curiosity and metacognition as well. So those are the real kind of building blocks. And I also kind of was struck by, all over the world when policymakers want to improve education, they tend to focus on the curriculum. So they change the curriculum documents, happens on regular intervals, 7 to every 10 years, those get updated and changed. It's not that curriculum is unimportant, it certainly is, but policymakers sometimes naively believe that all teachers do is they deliver curriculum. So change the deliverable, you've changed education. And I like to say that teachers don't so much deliver curriculum as they enact curriculum. So we are the ones that breathe life into that. And part of that breathing life into it is, not only through our instruction, but also through the culture. So we typically have not given teachers very many tools on how to understand how to build culture in their classroom. So my work kind of really focuses on, well, how is it we understand the culture and how is it that we then, in understanding it, can begin to kind of move and shape it in more powerful directions.
Yeah, you talk about those 8 forces, and as a great, you mentioned many of them, and that's a great preview to the next few questions I'm going to ask you, because I do want to look at that, those 8 forces in the book, Creating Cultures of Thinking. You outline those 8 forces that we have to really master in order to transform our schools. Again, we're not going to talk about all 8, but I want to focus on just a few to get a little bit deeper, because there are some that, I think catch your attention as maybe being I don't want to call them atypical, but they catch your attention and say, okay, I'm curious as to what that's about. I mean, I love the book. I remember hearing you talk about it at the NISA conference, and it really caught my attention. And I think it's important that listeners have this idea. So let's start with the idea of expectations. Now, you wrote something in the book interesting to me, and that is that it's not our expectations of students, but our expectations for students. And I love the way you phrase that. But so let's talk about what's the difference and what does that look like in a classroom?
That is a real shift in our thinking, because the way we typically use that word expectations in schools is we do say expectations of students. Right. And I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to say that that's unimportant or that's wrong in any way, but I do want to just kind of recognize, when we expect things of someone else, whether it be our students, whether it be, our colleagues, whether it be our spouse, our children, expectations of other people are basically cheap. I mean, they don't cost us anything, so it doesn't, I can easily come in to a classroom and say, I expect you to be on time. I expect, right. That's easy to kind of rattle that off. But when we say we have an expectation for something, that's kind of direction and goal oriented. So if I say I have an expectation, for, say, independence in my classroom, that would mean that I actually see a role for me as a teacher. I see a role for you as a student. And part of that expectation is an expectation of growth over time. So those kinds of expectations, the expectations for, I actually began the kind of in the book Intellectual Care to talk about what are we teaching for is a really important question. So what is it that we are trying to develop in our students? So thinking about, I'd really like to see this growth in my students as thinkers and learners over the course of the year. Those helped us kind of set our expectations. And that mutuality is so important because, that allows us then to focus on both our responsibilities, what we want students to be doing, and we're also looking at that kind of growth for that. So they aren't as simple as just kind of stating them and now we're done with expectations, but they are ongoing motivators of our action.
Yeah, it makes me think about, this idea of who takes the focus of responsibility or control. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but when you say, these are my expectations of students, in some ways the teacher can take a passive role and just say, this is what I expect of you. Whereas if I say, this is my expectation for you, then it's up to me to create the opportunity for you to develop those dispositions and become that. Am I on the right track with that? Is that kind of a way you might look at that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think that, this is perhaps a little subtlety that kind of shows a back and forth in Ron Berger, who's the chief academic officer in the Expeditionary Learning Schools, has written a lot and has really helped those schools to focus on quality and students doing quality work. But in those environments, it's not teachers coming in and saying, I expect quality work. I want quality work. I only want to see quality work. They are thinking about, how do I support my students in creating quality work? So they see a real role for them. So that's not merely an expectation of. So one teacher could say, I have an expectation of quality. I'm only going to accept quality, and just write it up on a paper and, hand it back to students. But there, they help students produce incredibly, rich, deep, quality work because the teacher has an expectation for quality. They see that there's a role for them in nurturing that. And that's something they pay attention to then over the course of the year. How are students getting better at being more independent, more self-sufficient in that production of quality?
Yeah, it's such a subtle nuance and yet makes a massive difference in terms of where we focus our attention and what we do in classrooms, for sure. You also mentioned this earlier. You talk about the importance of language. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into that as well. It seems so simple, and yet you claim that when teachers begin to notice and name student thinking and positive learning moves, their students begin to exhibit more of those behaviors and those actions. So I guess my question to you is it really that simple? That we can just simply begin to notice and name thinking in those positive learning moves, and that starts to transfer. Talk a little bit more about what that looks like and how that plays out in a classroom.
Yeah, well, I would say starts the ball rolling. It's one, thing to help create momentum, not the only thing, not a magic bullet. But this idea of noticing and naming comes from the work of Peter Johnston and choice words, and it applies to lots of things. But basically, as teachers, whatever it is that we notice and name, we are reinforcing. We're calling attention to it. We're saying this is important. In fact, this is so important, I see it and I notice it when it's happening. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what is it that teachers tend to notice and name the most? And I would say at the top of the list is they notice and name correctness. Yes, that's right. Good job. Well done. And so students become very used to, the goal is correctness. That's what I'm supposed to deliver. And then, it's not uncommon in those classrooms. You'll have students come up to teachers and say, is this right? Is this what you want? Is this how I'm supposed to do it? It's because they're so used to that's the goal of school. Another thing teachers notice and name a lot is behavior, which sends the signal that teachers care a lot about behavior. So by the same token, if we start noticing and naming other behaviors, we're sending a message to students that we care about those things. So when we start, noticing, name, and say, a student makes a comment, say, that's a really interesting perspective. That's a great connection. We're noticing and naming a contribution that's been made. And then when we start noticing and naming, which is a reinforcement there, then that starts happening more because we are kind of hardwired as human beings to kind of pay attention to, what do people in this environment care about? What's important here? What's worthwhile here? And most students have picked up on, the only thing that's important here is correctness. When that is the case, also, lots of research shows that when school, and again, this is the real dominant view, that when schools are all about correctness, high marks, getting the score, there's also an increase in cheating because students feel like that's justified because the goal is just to get kind of the high marks. But when the goal gets shifted, and again, it gets shifted not only in terms of our expectations, but in terms of our language too. We start noticing and naming and reinforcing new kinds of things. So I would say that kind of goes hand in hand. So when we have an expectation for students to grow as thinkers, then we want to support that expectation by noticing and naming the thinking that's going on. So if students only hear "good job, well done," you've got it, then they keep aiming for correctness. But when they start hearing "great thinking," there, I really like how you've put ideas together. That's an interesting connection. Then students are, getting reinforcement. They're getting valued for that contribution. They recognize that, and they begin to, do more of that. So you can kind of sometimes walk into a classroom and you might, as an outsider, see students doing something and just say, I wish my students would ask questions like that. I wish they would be making connections like that. Well, that doesn't happen in isolation. It wasn't that those teachers just got all the great kids that make connections and I didn't get any of them.
Yeah, that's right.
That teacher is probably sending messages, through, her use of language that is communicating that she cares about those things, that she's delighted to see that when that's happening and students start doing more of it.
It reminds me of two things. One is I really resonates with me because something I've said for many years is that what educators, teachers, principals, whatever, what teachers give their attention to is what students will eventually come to believe is important. And so it's just that idea of how we distribute our time and our attention will send those signals to students. And a simple way that I started to think about this as you were responding there was start noticing the doing, not just the done. Start noticing the process. Start noticing the contributions. Start noticing the way you challenge each other, the way that the thinking is happening. So rather than just focusing on the done, good job, well done, you behaved appropriately, whatever that might be, focus on the doing and the process as well. So I think that for me is how that really resonated with me. Does that work for you? Absolutely. Like if I say focus on the done, not the doing, not just the done. Yeah. One more I want to talk about in terms of those forces is modeling. So when educators hear this, and you point this out in the book, is that many people, when they hear modeling, they're thinking about instructional modeling, right? I show you, maybe practice together, and then off you go and you're independent. But that's not the kind of modeling that you're referring to. So what kind of modeling are you referring to when it comes to shaping a culture of thinking in a classroom?
Yeah, there actually are lots of different forms of modeling, but we are, most familiar with instructional modeling. Instructional modeling is a big part of direct instruction. And so a lot of teachers have been trained that, you need to show students how to do something and to pay attention to that. And again, not that that's unimportant, not that that's something, to not do at all, but as a cultural force, as a culture shaper there, what is more important than that is what we would call dispositional modeling. And dispositional modeling is the modeling of who we are as thinkers and learners. So do our students see our curiosity? Do they see our passion? Do they see how we learn from mistakes? Do they see how we reflect on what we've done? So we're kind of putting all of that, on display for our students. And another kind of big contrast here is that instructional modeling, kind of by definition, has you literally turn it on or off, because you often will begin an episode of instructional modeling with literally, now watch me. I'm going to show you how to do something. And so, you want to kind of look at that because you're trying to see how does this more expert do this? And you're trying to learn from what's being modeled there. So there literally is kind of an on-off switch. Dispositional modeling, there's no off switch. It is always on. So students are always watching us. And they're watching us also for our authenticity. So, is this fake? Does the teacher really, care about these things? And students can kind of read that there. Ted Sizer, had been a dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, was instrumental in starting Project Zero. The last book that he wrote with his wife, Nancy, the title was The Students Are Watching. And it's all about, students of every age are paying attention to the adults in their life. Because even for the youngest child, they know that one day they will be an adult. It may seem an incredibly long way away to them, but they know that one day they will be an adult. So they are paying attention to the adults in their life. For what does this look like? For what does it mean to actually be an adult? And, when students are sent to school, they're literally sent to school often, by their parents told them, you're going to school to learn. So their expectation is, I'm going to be around people who are going to be learners. Mm-hmm. And so are we authentic in that? Do we actually show our students what it means to be a learner? There's a lot of, the phrase, actually, we talked earlier about visible thinking, but visible thinking actually comes from an article written several decades ago, researcher Collins and Brown, and I think there's a third one, I'm sorry, I can't remember, about cognitive apprenticeship, making thinking visible. And so the whole idea of that we learn through being apprentices to the cognition, the thinking of more expert learners in any field. And one of the things the expert has to do is to make their thinking visible so that the novice can understand kind of what to do. And there have been a lot of, programs and interventions that are really designed on that model. So in mathematics, there's an intervention called paired problem solving, in which people actually externalize their thinking process there and learn from that. Reciprocal teaching and reading, developed by Anne Brown and Anna Marie Palanskar, is also about making the thinking of experts more visible there. So thinking about how important it is to be models of the thinking that we want students to actually engage in.
Yeah. So when you think about modeling, I want to sort of see if I'm on the right track here as well, because I'm thinking about maybe 3 ways that I could show modeling, and I'm wondering if these are all that you have contemplated. I don't mean that you haven't contemplated, but do you think about it this way? Is it, as a teacher, for example, showing my curiosity about the profession as a way of explaining to my students why I'm trying a new strategy, why I'm trying a new approach? Here's a different way we're going to approach this inquiry-based learning opportunity. Would you see that as part of my modeling of curiosity? For example, let me go through the others as well. Do I share with students something I'm curious about or lifelong learning in my own life? I'm learning to play the piano. I'm learning to do this in my personal life or anything like that. Or is it also, or I suppose, this idea of modeling my curiosity through my students, which is, I wonder where you're going to take this. It makes me interested to see what other dilemmas you might encounter. Are you thinking about all of that when you're talking about modeling?
Yeah, I would say all of those things kind of fit, within that kind of realm. So, we're often modeling when we're, like your first example there, sometimes we might talk about that as kind of peeling back the curtain.
Right.
So rather than we have, this lesson that we're just delivering on autopilot, or because we've got it all written down for us in some kind of guide, we're peeling back the curtain to explain, we're going to try it this way because I noticed yesterday. So we're peeling back our thought process so students can see teaching isn't this kind of just simple delivery. There's a lot of things kind of going on. And when we do that, when we peel back the curtain and we make our thinking visible to our students and we model that, they actually wind up being much more engaged and also much more forgiving, because they recognize, when mistakes happen, when things don't go. And they're also much more forthcoming with advice.
Right.
Because when we share with them, here's what we're trying to do, and that's why we're trying it this way, then they say like, okay, well, no, that's not working, because they're now a part of the plan. So the co-construction becomes, kind of more a part of that. One of the teachers that I wrote about, that I studied for intellectual character, John Throkeld, a mathematics teacher there, he regularly would come in and say, "Oh, I'm reading this book I read last night," and the math problems and things would come up, and they knew that this is a guy that's like always learning and really interested, and it's not just, oh, here's the lesson for today. He was always bringing in, what he was reading, and there was always a book on his desk, and he was always talking about that. So they knew that mathematics wasn't this kind of dead subject that you just kind of learn about it, but there's always interesting angles and stuff to learn and apply, and he was always bringing that in the classroom.
Yeah, it seems to me that the modeling, if I were to encapsulate it in one word, I would say it humanizes us as teachers. It shows our humanity, and that's where students connect with us, and that's where they start to see it as not just this something I deliver, but here's someone who's trying to guide an experience and is open to the interaction between us. So we know teachers will be at various places, and maybe I want to operate off a caricature, because I know that not everybody is at ground zero, not to pick up on Project Zero, but the idea that there's probably teachers that have certain practices already in place. But let's just take the caricature. I'm a teacher, and I'm listening to you, Ron, and what you're saying is really resonating with me. I've got a classroom where I'm only focused on right, wrong. I only focus on end results, and I want to bring thinking into the classroom. And again, knowing that teachers are not a monolith, we know they're at various places. But if you were to give some advice on where to get started, I'm in that position. I want to bring thinking into my classroom. I can't do it all at once. What are some of the most effective or efficient ways that I can at least start to bring that into my classroom and create a culture of thinking? Where do I begin?
Well, you begin by identifying the kinds of thinking that you're wanting to promote, the kinds of thinking that are important in your classroom. So I think that's a really fundamental question that all teachers need to be able to answer. So asking yourself, what kind of thinking is important to me here? What kind of thinking is important in my subject area, whether it be music, mathematics, literature, history, sport. So identifying the kinds of thinking, and that's is a fundamental starting place. Sometimes that's a challenge for folks. I have had folks, really draw a complete blank on that, and because their style of teaching and what their experience has been is, well, I just want kids to listen to me and write down what I say. And it's like, well, okay, then you're going to have a hard time. That you need to identify, well, what kind of thinking is really important. So when teachers identify the kinds of thinking that are important, that's kind of the window. When one tool for that is the understanding map. So that identifies 8 types of thinking that are really important to the development of understanding. And they aren't the only types of thinking they are, but those are things which people would all recognize. They aren't going to be these obtuse things that they've never heard about. The idea of making connections, considering different perspectives, reasoning with evidence, building explanations. So, things like that. So when you kind of recognize, here's what's, I'm trying to cultivate, then you can begin to kind of make room for that. Mm-hmm. And then I would say the other, with that in place, the other shift that teachers need to make it begins with a recognition that learning doesn't occur through the delivery of information. Learning only occurs when the learner does something with that information. Right. So everyone has content to teach, but your question then with that content is, here's the content. I'm not just concerned with the delivery of the content, but now what's the thinking I want students to do with that content? So plan lessons with both of those things in mind, the content and then the thinking that you want students to do. So you might say, I really want students to begin to, make connections between this content and other content, or I really want them to begin to evaluate this content, through this lens or this particular perspective. So that then begins to bring thinking into the lesson. So identifying the kinds of thinking that you're after, beginning to plan lessons with the thinking in mind, I think are a really important way to start. And then one very quick kind of practice that is easy to insert for everyone is that simple routine of asking, what makes you say that? So just get in the habit of a student gives an answer and just rather than answering with, great, well done, just answer with, well, what makes you say that? And then the student's going to elaborate, going to tell more about kind of where that answer, came from. And that will catch on very, very quickly, both in your practice and in students' expectation. I have to say that single question is kind of the epitome of a thinking routine, because even within one individual lesson, a teacher can make that a real routine. And you know that it's a routine because there comes a moment when you get in that habit of asking, what makes you say that? What makes you say that? Again, even within a single lesson, you'll notice that some student gives an answer and automatically explains why they think that, because they already know that question's coming. So it's already a part of the routine, even within a simple single class period. And that's what we're kind of after. It becomes an expectation of, this is how we do things here. Now we don't just give answers, but we give answers with explanations.
I love that. As you were saying that, I was thinking the same thing, is that when that becomes habitual and the teacher doesn't actually have to use the prompt, that's when you've got that culture developed in the classroom for sure. Okay, so let's finish up by talking about the new book. The floor is going to be yours. It's coming out in June. Cultures of Thinking in Action, 10 Mindsets to Transform Our Teaching and Students' Learning. Again, I know you're trying to build upon the ideas of creating cultures of thinking. So the floor is yours, Ron. Tell us about the new book coming out in June.
So, a couple of decades here dealing with cultures of thinking. And one of the things that had been on my mind a lot is looking at why is it then that some teachers are really able to kind of take these ideas, move forward with them in kind of a really, really powerful way. And in other places, it's a little bit more of a struggle or may even kind of languish there. And I became aware that it was having certain kind of mindsets that, as important and as valuable as tools and practices are, they can be incredibly valuable because we can use ways of behaving and practices to kind of leverage us into new ways of thinking. That ultimately it is having these mindsets which then wind up being the motivators of our action. And there's a long history of research and education that ultimately what at the end of the day, what makes the most difference in terms of a teacher's practice are the mindsets they have, their beliefs and their values about teaching and learning and about how those things happen. Alan Schoenfeld at UC Berkeley, who was also the head of the American Educational Research Association, he for several years had a project trying to figure out and kind of model what happens in the classroom. So how is it we can kind of predict what happens in the classroom? And he says, the plans that teachers have are only useful to the extent that nothing unusual, nothing unexpected happens in the classroom. They will carry out those plans. But as soon as something unexpected happens, and that unexpectedness may be a student question, it may be confusion, and those things happen all the time, is that all of a sudden teachers have to step out of the lesson, and then they're relying on their beliefs and values. And then they're making those choices about, well, how do I proceed? What do I do next? And so when you kind of value and you have the belief that learning is a consequence of thinking, you're less inclined to tell students, oh, here's how you do it. Here's what you do. Here's how you kind of solve that. You're more inclined to, how do I help them think about this problem? How do I make my thinking visible? How do I do that? How do I help them to think about this rather than merely how do I tell them how to do that? So in the new book, we identified 10 kind of key mindsets. They aren't ones, people who are familiar with my work, they aren't ones that have been hidden, that all of a sudden these kind of appear from nowhere. You will see echoes and threads of them and mention of some of them in all of my books. A few new ones maybe have kind of come to the fore a little bit more than they had. But identifying those, and then the book really explains why they're important, why we should care about them, what they look like in classrooms, using some case studies there, and then a lot of tools for how to move forward with them.
Love it. Love it. Looking forward to that coming out in June. And listeners, you can make sure you tap into that as well. So 2 questions as we finish up, Ron. These are 2 questions that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. The first one, you can take this in any direction you want to, but it's a simple question. And it is this: educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
I would say that actually what keeps me up at night is now, all of the extreme efforts to control and constrain teaching that's happening in some locations, restricting what books can be on the shelf, what we're allowed to talk about, wanting to erase certain groups from discussion. And so I say that's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah, you see that happening all over, and through policies, curricular revisions, different statements that are being brought forward. You can see a real tightening in some locations for sure about what the profession is and what is and is not allowed, so to speak, in terms of those conversations. So definitely worthy of being kept up at night for sure. Last question. We're going to end on a lighter note, of course, and listeners know what's coming. It's questions about food, because I love food. And as I travel around, I like to think about what are some of the great places to eat. You live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So here's the question, quite simply, and it doesn't have to be a high end. It could be low end, hole in the wall, doesn't matter. But where's the best place to eat in Santa Fe, New Mexico?
Well, one of my kind of go-to places is called the Tune-Up, which is much more a locals, kind of very simple, very basic dive. It's not strictly New Mexicans, kind of has a El Salvadoran influence there, but great green chili there, which is, if you come to New Mexico, you have to have green chili. And we put it on everything. So, all right. So you can find it in lots of things there. So it's a fun place to eat. Very kind of good food there.
Excellent. Love that. Tune Up, it's called. Fantastic. So if I'm ever in Santa Fe, got to have green chili, and we'll make sure we head to Tune Up. Love it. Listeners, you can and should follow Ron on social media. The Twitter handle is @RonRichhart. There's a Facebook page called Making Thinking Visible. And of course, the website, www.ronrichhart.com. We'll have links in the show notes for all of those, so you have access to those. So listeners, you can check those out. Ron, really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Thanks for doing this. Great to see you again. And again, thanks. Really appreciate it.
Great to see you too, Tom.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
In Assessment Corner this week, I want to talk about this concept of idea cults, because nowhere in education do I see it more than when it comes to conversations about assessment and grading. Now, this idea of idea cults I picked up from Adam Grant's book, Think Again. And I mentioned this book before on previous episodes, and I just want to reiterate what a fantastic read it is when it comes to creating change and rethinking ideas that we've long held. Anyway, I was recently reading Chapter 8, which is called Charged Conversations, and I came across a passage that really caught my attention when it comes to some of the ways that assessment and grading are talked about, especially online. Now, the subtitle of the chapter is Depolarizing Our Divided Discussions. Now, here's the passage that caught my attention, and I want you to think about what you've read and what you've heard about assessment and grading, especially on social media. Now, Adam Grant writes on page 176, quote, "From time to time, I've run into idea cults, groups that stir up a batch of oversimplified intellectual Kool-Aid and recruit followers to serve it wildly. They preach the merits of their pet concept and prosecute anyone who calls for nuance or complexity," end quote. Now, I'm not here to call out any specific group or any specific idea, though I'm sure longtime listeners, you can probably figure out a few that I'm thinking of. I think with this being episode 100, This is a good time to encapsulate one of the most important ideas that I talk about, think about, and promote when it comes to assessment and grading. And that is that there are very few absolutes when it comes to assessment and grading. When talking about anything to do with assessment, beginning a sentence with the words always or never are usually an indication of either a hyperbolic position or an uninformed one. The biggest challenge with that is that the hyperbolic positions tend to get the most attention on social media and in other forums. Now, I don't think that's unique to assessment and grading, as it seems we live in a society right now that seems to value extreme positions. Extreme positions seem to drive the societal narrative. So again, this is not something unique to education, nor is it unique to assessment and grading. Now, my advice to you when it comes to developing your own assessment literacy and continuing to grow in your understanding of sound assessment practices and grading practices is to be cautious of anyone who speaks with such definitiveness that there is no space for a reasonable conversation or a debate of ideas. Now, again, I can't speak for everyone or every idea, but my default thought is that when someone is hyperbolic or over the top with their assertions, it reveals a level of insecurity about their position. Again, I can't say that about everyone or every idea, but I wonder sometimes why some are so afraid of a nuanced conversation. What I'm about to say could be taken as arrogant, it could be taken as elitist, it could be taken as something like that. It really is not meant to be that, but I'm sure someone will listen to this and probably spin it that way. And even if they do, though, does that mean what I'm saying doesn't have merit because they don't like the way I said it? I mean, that, of course, is another red flag. Because when someone starts arguing about your argument methods, then you know they've lost the debate of ideas. When they focus on how you say something rather than what you just said, you know you are winning the debate of ideas. Okay, so here goes. I want to say this clearly. I think some, not most, not many, whatever, I think some are afraid of a nuanced conversation about assessment and grading because they don't have the depth and breadth of understanding about assessment and grading to actually have that nuanced conversation. Again, I know that's going to come across as arrogant and elitist and all of that, but that doesn't mean I'm not right. The one thing I've learned over my now 19 years being fully invested in this assessment work and 12 years of doing this full time is that there are almost no absolutes when it comes to assessment. Yes, there are principles we need to follow, but in every situation there are choices and nuances that can be shaped by the context, by the board policies, or even by community norms. But what I see on Twitter, what I see in Facebook groups or on Instagram are these oversimplified assertions that create these idea cults that end up defining its members. One of the clues that I use to suspect these idea cults is when people start identifying themselves as their practice, right? I'm and then fill in the blank. When you conflate your identity with your teaching, assessment, or grading practices, you are going to become overly invested in that particular position or practice, making it even more difficult for you to change your mind. Now, you might recall a quote I shared with you earlier this year in 2023 in a previous episode from the prologue of Think Again, where Grant writes, quote, "Reconsidering something we believe deeply can threaten our identities, making it feel as if we're losing a part of ourselves," end quote. Change in education and nuanced conversations would be a lot easier and a lot more productive if we as educators would stop conflating what we do with who we are. Now, here are a few ways that you can spot idea cults or even check whether you are inadvertently a part of one. The first one, as I already mentioned, is the use of the words always and never. If you find yourself saying, "This is always good," or "This is never wrong," or "This is always wrong," "This is never right," you are either part of an idea cult or at least pushing the ideas that underpin one. A second way to figure out whether or not you're part of an idea cult, and this is how I interpreted some of the things that Grant wrote in the chapter, is that idea cults need to create enemies or an opposition. Idea cults won't thrive unless there's some oppositional force, whether that force is real or fictional, that the idea cult can push back against. You have to create an enemy. And Grant calls this binary bias. The binary bias presumes that the world is divided into two sides, believers and non-believers. And in any conversation about assessment and grading, if you catch any hint or whiff of a believers versus non-believers binary, run. Run away immediately. Run away as fast as you can. When you try to have a nuanced conversation about assessment and grading, the idea cult will try to oversimplify your position and cast you as a non-believer, as somebody who is defending the opposite of the idea that they're promoting. Just watch for this. You're going to see it, and you will not be able to unsee it. Now, a third way to spot an idea cult is to check whether you are inadvertently a part of one by examining the degree to which your identity as an educator is wrapped around your practices. Again, so many educators, whether they be teachers or principals or school district staff, claim to be lifelong learners, and yet they have such a definitiveness about their identity in terms of it being defined by their practices that there doesn't seem to be much room for any lifelong learning. Just remember that everything in assessment is context dependent and nuanced, and that the definitiveness with which some speak about any topic in assessment and grading tends to reveal a limited or lack of depth in terms of their own understanding. And again, I know there are a lot of people out there who know a lot more about assessment than I do, and I continue to learn from them. I read their research, I ask them questions, I continue to be curious about assessment and all of the nuances that go along with it. I want to try to continue to refine my understanding of this incredibly complex topic. Pithy tweets and oversimplified assertions do nothing but unnecessarily divide the conversations and create these idea cults that are actually more a hindrance than helpful when it comes to the widespread use of sound assessment and grading practices. We need nuanced and intelligent conversations about sound assessment and grading practices. We don't need idea cults that are trying to build a brand, gain followers on social media with oversimplified ideas that don't even pass the basic level of scrutiny of what the research indicates are the most favorable practices when it comes to assessment and grading.
3, 2, 1.
Okay, that's it for this week. Remember to follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Also, please email the podcast, tomschimmerpod@gmail.com, if you've got questions for Assessment Corner, or if you have any suggestions or feedback for me about the podcast. And a reminder to check the show notes for the links for the upcoming professional learning events coming up this spring. Next time, my guest will be Eric Scheniger. Eric was a teacher and the award-winning principal at New Milford High School. Eric is now the author or co-author of 7 books, including 2021's Disruptive Thinking, Preparing Learners for Their Future. So that is going to be the focus of our conversation. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts. But again, a rating or a review on any platform will help grow the podcast's reach. And if you like what you hear, please keep spreading the word about the podcast to your friends, your colleagues, or on social media. I would really appreciate that. Have a great week, everyone.